Hey folks, tonight I'm not kicking off with a battle or some wild party. Nope, we're diving headfirst into the super personal and pungently medieval world of hygiene. Welcome to an era where people feared bathing more than plagues. Garlic was perfume, and neighbors casually tossed weird stuff out the window like it was totally normal. So before you get comfy, do me a favor, smash that like button and subscribe, but only if you actually dig what I do here, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious who's tuning in from all over the globe. Now, dim the lights, turn on the fan for some relaxing background noise, and let's slide into tonight's journey. Cleanliness is next to godliness, yeah. Nobody was saying that in the 14th century. Here's a shocker. Early Middle Ages bathing was actually a good thing. Monasteries had baths. Roman traditions of soaking and scrubbing still lingered somewhere in Europe. But as time went on, especially by late Middle Ages, the idea of bathing flipped from healthy to downright dangerous. So what changed? Long story short, fear, superstition, and a total misunderstanding of how the human body works. People thought hot water opened your pores, which they believed were like little doors for disease to sneak in. Imagine during a plague, you bathe and then think, great, I just turned myself into a death sponge. That was the mindset back then. They feared bathing too much would weaken your body and basically invite sickness in. Water wasn't for cleaning, it was a threat. Things didn't help when public baths became morally sketchy spots. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many public baths, once hubs of hygiene and social hangouts, got a bad rap. Some were like spas, others basically brothels. Eventually, religious leaders linked bathing with sin, and in medieval Europe, that was the fastest way to shut something down. So instead of scrubbing thoroughly, a lot of folks just stopped bathing altogether, not because they loved being dirty, but because staying dry was seen as safer, holier, and honestly, less awkward. Sure, being naked is one thing, but naked and soaking in hot water that was basically inviting the devil to go for a swim. But don't picture everyone as mud monsters. People still washed their hands, face, and feet with cloth and herbal water. Full body soaks were rare, reserved for the rich, the brave, or those who were itching crazy. So yeah, medieval folks feared bathing, but not out of laziness or stupidity. They were trying 14th century style to stay healthy. Problem was, without germ theory, indoor plumbing, or basic microbe knowledge, their strategies were more paranoid than preventative. Once upon a time, in a town that hadn't smelled horse poop or regret yet, public baths were the place for hygiene, health, and some awkwardly close chit-chat, inspired by Rome. Early medieval baths offered warm water, communal tubs, and a dash of hope. This was where villagers could soak, steam, and gossip, basically a medieval spa day. Minus the cucumbers and scented candles, monks, merchants, even low-level nobles used them. Cleanliness was once possible and even trendy. Then things took a turn for the worse. By the 13th century, baths started earning a bad rep for multitasking. Bathing wasn't just about getting clean, it was about making friends. Some baths added extra services, with attendants who were a bit too friendly, and the water saw way too many strangers. The line between healthcare and, well, party invitation got blurry real fast. Soon enough, the church stepped in. Public nudity, even with washcloth modesty, was frowned upon. Sexual misbehavior, even worse, baths became symbols of sin, disease, and scandal. So when the Black Death showed up, people cheered, shutting them down for good. I mean, how do you spread plague through a bathhouse once it's closed and labeled a filthy zone? But it wasn't just sin and sickness trashing baths. Suspicion played a big role. Over time, bathing was seen as a luxury, even a danger. The idea of soaking in warm water, especially with strangers, was thought to lead to both physical and mental collapse. And so, one by one, baths closed. Some turned into bakeries, others just rotted away, a poetic end for buildings that once kept people clean. Meanwhile, monks quietly mourned. Many still kept up hygiene for centuries, even scheduled baths, but now those routines were met with suspicion. The church didn't ban cleanliness outright, they just made it really hard. Welcome to the golden age of dry-off medieval style. Soap became optional, water the enemy, and baths relics of a time when scrubbing didn't come with consequences. Despite the church freaking out over bare elbows and widespread belief that hot baths invited plague in through your pores, medieval people didn't fully ditch bathing. They just made it a once-in-a-while thing or whenever the smell started talking. And now, let's start with, nobles did bathe, just not so often that their rubber ducks got all wrinkly. They hired folks to haul huge pots of boiling water, because indoor plumbing was a fantasy back then, and poured it into a big wooden tub lined with linen cloth. Then they sprinkled in herbs like lavender, sage, or whatever grew nearby that didn't smell like feet. Honestly, it wasn't really a bath, more like soaking in a medieval herbal soup. The tub was usually set up right in the bedroom or near the fireplace. Privacy depended on how powerful or shameless you were. Some even shared the tub with their spouse, because what's more romantic than swimming together in each other's grime, medieval fondue style? Poor folks bathed too, but mostly in rivers, barrels, or whatever held water without biting each other. Not for cleanliness, just convenience. The phrase bathing the kid, the shirt, and the goat all at once probably wasn't a one-time joke. In winter, bathing took a backseat to survival, so instead of soap and water, people used the fake clean and move on strategy. Some public baths still hung around, especially in southern Europe, where the weather was nicer and plumbing a bit less medieval. Keeping the dream of cleanliness alive, those baths could be quite fancy, with steam rooms and herbal treatments, or just places to hang out for activities definitely not Vatican approved. Either way, you left feeling refreshed, a bit steamy, and possibly mildly judged. Special occasions like childbirth or recovering from plague meant real baths, because nothing says welcome to the world or please don't die like dunking in a chilly rosemary water tub. When soaking in hot water got suspicious, people thought heat attracted disease, like a bar on a Friday night. The medieval world switched to the next best thing, sponge baths. But don't imagine soft, store-bought sponges. Nope. They used linen cloth soaked in warm water, herbs, or vinegar, and wiped themselves like they were polishing a very sensitive chair. Hygiene here meant wiping down, if you were lucky. Someone else did the wiping, if you were noble. Having help was a thing, but nobody was thrilled about it. This washing style focused on hands, face, armpits, and sometimes feet. Basically the usual suspects for being dirty. Wearing linen undergarments, especially shirts and long tunics, helped soak up sweat and dirt. So changing clothes often was about as close to modern hygiene standards as you got. Outer clothes might be stiff as a board, but the linens underneath smelled fresh. Nobody fooled themselves into thinking this was a proper bath. But when water was scarce, or you believed thorough washing invited plague, this was the safest bet, and in a world without deodorant, toothpaste, or showers, a cloth dipped in rosewater or vinegar was the medieval spa experience minus the spa part. And honestly, spa days were totally missing for the wealthy. Servants boiled water, tossed in herbs like rosemary or savory, then gently washed their masters while pretending not to judge. Peasants boiled water over fire, scooped it into bowls, and did the same maybe without the subtle judgment, but definitely with more drafts. Monks sometimes had a bath schedule more disciplined than most people. Many monasteries demanded regular washing, though more for spiritual cleanliness than actual hygiene. Either way, the result was the same: a light scrub, a bit of dampness, and just enough cleanliness to avoid scaring the livestock. So, not glamorous, but passable at least, until you had to ride a horse through 6 hours of mud. If medieval hair had a motto, it'd be flammable, but fragrant. Contrary to myths, people didn't just walk around with birds' nests on their heads, at least not on purpose. They still washed their hair, just not often, and definitely without anything like shampoo. So what did they use? A homemade concoction, sounding like the earliest draft of a spell book. A popular choice was straw soap made from wood ash and animal fat, great for cutting grease, but prone to scalp burns if overused. Add questionable water quality, and you've got medieval chemical peeling for those wanting to keep their hair longer. Egg yolks served as a gentle cleanser, yes. That meant sitting in a freezing hut with raw egg dripping down your neck, convincing yourself it was hair nourishment. Others washed with beer, which at least made you smell like you'd had a wild night out, even if you were just trying to kill lice. Some recipes included vinegar soaked with rosemary or lavender, masking odors and creating the illusion of care. But no one was shampooing and rinsing twice. This was more like splash and wring for speed. Water temperature mattered too. Hot water was said to weaken your brain. Cold water could bring on plague. And lukewarm was the safe, comfy middle ground. Assuming you had enough firewood to boil water and didn't mind waiting 3 hours for a bucket of bath water your siblings hadn't already used. Combing your hair was a daily thing. Combs made from bone, wood, or horn were common and often intricately carved, a rare touch of elegance in an otherwise itchy world. People even took pride in long, silky hair, especially noble ladies who could spend hours braiding, curling, and covering their hair while silently praying. The nearby fire didn't turn all that effort into a sweaty mess. Taking care of your teeth in medieval Europe wasn't about flashing a sparkling smile. It was more like, hey, I still got teeth. How about you? They didn't totally ignore oral hygiene, just didn't really get it. So they made do with whatever they had, mainly cloth, charcoal, and blind hope. Toothbrushes, nope. That luxury was a few centuries away. Instead, they rubbed their teeth with linen soaked in salt, crushed mint, or burnt incense ash. The goal wasn't pearly whites, it was survival. If your breath didn't knock people out, consider yourself a winner. Some folks chewed on tiny wooden sticks from hazel or oak trees, fraying the ends into makeshift brushes, basically biodegradable, tree-scented dental floss. To freshen up, they'd chew fennel seeds, cloves, or cardamom, depending on their budget or how good they were at borrowing spices from the kitchen. The rich rinsed with vinegar, wine, or frankincense water, because nothing says fancy dental care like gargling with the stuff they embalmed pharaohs in. Toothpaste. Yeah, sort of. Think powdered charcoal, crushed eggshells, and oyster shell ash mixed with honey or oil into a gritty paste. Your mouth might not be cleaner, but at least it felt like you just sanded your teeth. Dentists back then, if you can call barbers, moonlighting as tooth pullers, dentists just yanked out loose or rotten teeth. No anesthesia, no chit-chat, just a sturdy chair, strong hands, and some prayers. After the ordeal, you'd rinse with wine, hoping your soul would bail before the infection set in. Still, not everyone in the Middle Ages was toothless. Rural folks eating less sugar often had healthier teeth than today's snack addicts, but cavities spread fast, and the only cure was divine intervention. Honestly, if you wandered into a medieval market, your first reaction wouldn't be awe, but the urgent need to puke from the classic stench. Medieval Europe was basically a lifetime subscription to eau de doom, no sewers, no deodorants, and barely any working baths, so the streets smelled like a charming mix of sweat, animals, rotting food, and hope. If your nose survived the fish market and tannery, congrats, you were basically a superhuman tourist. How did people stand this funk? They invented medieval air fresheners called pomanders. Pomanders were small hollow balls stuffed with herbs and spices, worn around the neck or pinned inside clothes like medieval portable air purifiers, filled with cloves, cinnamon, lavender, or musk, often soaked in amber perfume. Women carried these sachets to mask their own smell and politely fend off everyone else's. Some even braided rosemary or marjoram into their hair, hygienic, fashionable, and exorcism approved. Wealthier folks splurged on perfumes imported from the Middle East or Italy, made from rose oil or civet, a fragrant extract from a cat-like critter's rear end, which is definitely a conversation starter. Applying perfume was an art dab, flick, and pretend you're not just covering up boiled cabbage and regret. The ambient smell, a delightful cocktail of open sewers, candle smoke, and whatever the butcher tossed onto the street. Cities were basically fogged in a stink cloud. But hey, misery loves company. Welcome to the garlic-scented struggle. Churches preached spiritual cleanliness, but body odor was more your call. Pleasant scent meant you were rich or holy. Bad smell, just your average Joe. If you've ever worried all day about your armpits smelling like a suspect criminal, try living like that forever, no deodorant. Everybody's smelling like they just dueled in wool for 3 days straight. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where your personal odor wasn't a flaw. It was your brand. No deodorant sticks. No sprays. Definitely no aluminum-packed antiperspirants. People just sweated and made friends with the smell to fight the funk. They used tricks like alum powder, a natural mineral with mild antibacterial and astringent powers. It didn't stop sweat, but at least cut down the stench if you remembered to apply it, and didn't mind rubbing your armpits with crushed rocks. Others used powder, vinegar mouth rinses, or crushed herbs like sage, mint, and rosemary. Effectiveness, not really the point. The logic was simple: if you can't stop sweating, at least smell like a salad. Scented handkerchiefs were a noble trend, mainly to hold up to your nose when passing crowds. Who wanted to smell like medieval stew? Everyone tried to smell like herbal stew instead. Medieval medicine played a part. Two healers believed sweating was how your body detoxed, so blocking sweat was suspicious, maybe even dangerous. You were expected to sweat and stink so your body could clean itself. You weren't dirty, just medically fragrant. Then there was fashion, layers upon layers of wool, linen, and fur trapping heat and moisture like a mobile greenhouse. Add fires, feasts, and plagues, and you get a smell so intense you'd want to run for the hills. But hey, you weren't alone. Everyone stank king, priest, even the turnip seller who hadn't bathed since Epiphany. In short, there was no real deodorant back then. But hey, everyone was in the same stinky boat, in a world without showers, non-toxic soap, or shoving herbs under your arms to smell less terrible. Medieval folks found an unexpected hygiene hero linen, not for eating. Obviously, wear it close to your skin and swap it out before it starts walking off on its own. Linen underwear was the silent savior of the Middle Ages, absorbent, breathable, and tough as nails, perfect under thick wool and fur layers that were a nightmare to wash. Shirts and cloaks made of linen soaked up sweat, dirt, and every other delightful thing your body pumped out. In a world obsessed with moisture, but clueless about soap. The logic was simple: wash the linen, not yourself. Because scrubbing your own skin was risky business. Just ask anyone who survived the plague. But washing your shirt, totally safe. People might go a week without bathing, but would change their linen undergarments, sometimes twice a week, by medieval standards. Basically, sainthood. Linen was so respected it became a status symbol. Clean white shirts meant you had your life together. Gray, stiff, moldy ones meant you were either poor, possessed, or recently zombified. For women, a linen cloak was their trusty sidekick, shielding outerwear from sweat and, more importantly, from smelling like it. Think medieval Frazier deodorant, less chemicals, way more judgment, if you couldn't keep it clean. Knights wore linen under their armor to avoid turning into smoked meat at tournaments. Monks wore it under robes. Peasants wore patched up, threadbare linen tunics, and kept them together with sheer willpower. Of course, washing linen wasn't fun. You had to boil water, beat the fabric on rocks, and pray the water didn't wash it all away. Still easier than bathing yourself or facing the spiritual fallout of baring your chest to warm water. If there's one consistent theme in medieval hygiene, it's itching, not from some allergy to linen or straw, although maybe sometimes, but mostly because everyone was running a traveling circus of lice, fleas, and ticks on their bodies. Lice were such a daily nuisance, they were basically uninvited roommates. You didn't get lice, you just had them. Everyone did. Rich, poor, devout. Drunk lice didn't discriminate. They were the true medieval equalizers. So what did people do? First, they used lice combs. These were usually bone or wood, your medieval equivalent of a toothbrush. But instead of brushing teeth, you were scraping bugs off your head like a tiny, screaming garden. The fine teeth of the comb pulled out lice, nits, and tested your patience. Another trick was boiling clothes or roasting them near fire to kill lice. Just hope you didn't torch your only shirt in the process. That's why you'll see medieval paintings of people holding their clothes near flames, not washing, but executing bugs. The classic solution: shave your head, especially monks or anyone proud of their bald spot. Totally effective, but a bit dramatic. Sometimes they wore wigs, which could double as lice hotels if not cleaned well. The logic was simple: no hair, no home for parasites. Fleas were also a pain, especially for those sleeping on straw mattresses or hanging out with animals. No flea collars or bug sprays back then, just smoky fires and herbal sachets tossed on the bedding. Some swore by certain scents to repel fleas. Others just hoped the pests moved on to a stinkier neighbor. The real solution? Suck it up. Everyone itched. everyone scratched. It was life like taxes, death, or stepping on something indescribable near the market. Ah, medieval toilets, the name alone, promises way more comfort than reality. For the upper class, castles had guardrobes, basically wardrobes with holes cut into stone seats, dropping waste straight down sometimes into moats, sometimes pits, occasionally onto a forgotten patch of ground. These spots were usually perched high on towers for privacy and a bit of thrill, courtesy of gravity. If you stood below one of these, you quickly learned not to loiter. The common folk weren't so lucky. Most did their business outside in forests, near rivers, or behind cowsheds. Some villages had communal pits, medieval public toilets, with standards so low they're almost underground, privacy even lower. Neighbors might be chatting crops, while farmers squatted nearby every night for their calls of nature. Chamber pots were the real MVPs here. These portable thrones were stashed under beds or beside sleeping spots, ready to collect midnight gifts. If you've never had the pleasure of relieving yourself into a cold ceramic bowl while your family snoozes in the pitch dark, congrats, you're not medieval. So how did they deal with the contents? Simple, they tossed it straight out the window, shouting "Guardilo, watch out for the water." People just tossed their waste straight onto the street below, ideally not hitting anyone unlucky enough to be walking by. Accuracy? Yeah, not so much. Street cleaning basically depended on gravity and a bunch of pigs. Sometimes the city had gutters or ditches to carry the crap away, but those usually got clogged, overflowed, or just sat there fermenting into a local delicacy. Toilet paper? Forget it. Folks used rag scraps, moss, straw, their own hands, or if they were feeling fancy, bits of wool or linen. Sounds gross. Try imagining using snow in winter. Yep, they actually did that. Before everyone collectively decided that bathing was suspicious, or even sinful, public baths in medieval Europe were actually booming. Not just tubs and soap. These places were the hottest social hubs around. Think medieval spas with some unexpected twists. Baths offered hot water, steam rooms, massages, food, music, and if you were lucky, a little bit of shady business on the side, at best. They were community health centers. At worst, they were gossip hubs, gluttony dens, and mild scandal factories, sometimes all three before lunch. They called them stews, not because you soaked forever, though sometimes you did, but because the hot water steamed up like a sauna. Mixed gender bathing wasn't rare, especially in Germany or Italy, where folks were more chill about nudity. Not always awkward, families went together. Monks bathed in pairs, but humans being humans. Boundaries were as blurry as the water, of course. This made baths a favorite target of the church. Priests warned that mixed bathing was sinful, and honestly, they weren't totally off. Some baths quietly morphed into brothels. They had plumbing, hot water heated not just by fires under tubs. Then came the plague, and everything changed. When the Black Death hit, baths got blamed. Doctors believed open pores invited disease, and hot water opened pores. So, you get the idea, germs. What germs kind of math? Baths got shut down, their reputation tanked, and suddenly, public bathing vanished forever. Some places clung to the tradition a bit longer, though Southern Europe, the Middle East, and some port cities kept their stews boiling for a few more decades. But in Northern and Central Europe, baths disappeared faster than your dignity after slipping into a public tub. What was left was a mix of nostalgia and confusion. Baths had been warm, lively places, but turned into symbols of sin, sickness, and some seriously bad hygiene choices. By the 16th century, people stopped soaking with strangers. They just dabbed vinegar under their arms and prayed soap would show up soon. Medieval soap was like medicine, harsh, experimental, and making you seriously question your life choices, theoretically effective. But using it felt more like punishment than self-care. The most common recipe mixed animal fat with live fancy talk for refined fat and wood ash. Together, they created something that could scrub dirt, grease, and maybe even your soul off any surface. No pastel-scented bars back then. It was a rough, waxy block that looked like something you'd avoid stepping on barefoot, making it required patience and a strong stomach cooking sheep or pig fat, stirring alkaline ash water, then waiting for it to harden. If you added herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint, you could pretend it was artisanal, but mostly it just smelled like damp campfire and disappointment. Soap was mainly for washing clothes and heavy scrubbing, not for skin, at least not often. Skin was considered delicate, and lye soap could turn your bath into a mild chemical burn. Still, people used it when necessary, especially before weddings, court appearances, or plague outbreaks. Fancier soap came from the Islamic world and southern Europe, especially Castile soap from Spain, made with olive oil instead of animal fat, way gentler on your skin. These soaps were luxury items, traded all across the Mediterranean and reserved for those who didn't smell like a goat daily. But for most, soap was a tool, not a treat. They used it for laundry, dishwashing, and sometimes hand washing only when their hands were really, really gross. It wasn't something to use as a hygiene habit. It was a monthly event, like taxes or full moons. Some people barely touched soap their whole lives and still considered themselves clean, especially when everyone around them did the same. Community stink standards always dragged the bar down. In medieval Europe, laundry wasn't just a chore, it was a full-body workout, a social event, and a date with frostbite. Forget washing machines or laundromats you wanted clean clothes. You had to boil, beat, and pray. Weather had to cooperate. 2, most washing happened in rivers, which sounds romantic until you remember those rivers doubled as sewers, livestock baths, and occasionally body disposal sites. But hey, flowing water is flowing water. First, you'd soak fabric in alkaline water or urine, yes, actual human pee, collected in jars and aged until it turned into strong urine. It was prized for its ammonia content, which helped bleach and clean stains. The smell, not great, but back when perfume was optional and hygiene was optional with interpretation, it did the job. After soaking, clothes would be dragged to the river, rubbed on wooden planks or big stones, then beaten with oars. This charming little ritual was called fabric rubbing, not a gentle rinse, more like a full-on interrogation of your clothes. This torture session could last for hours and usually needed the combined muscle power of all the local washerwomen equal parts, terrifying and impressive arm strength flex. Then came rinsing, wringing, drying, and if it rained, well, you waited another day, hoping your shirt didn't suddenly learn to breathe. Clothes were usually spread over bushes, fences, or strung between trees and the straw huts of the countryside folk. A medieval village looked like a never-ending flea market. Of course, not everyone did their own laundry. The rich had servants, monasteries had monks on laundry duty, and some towns even had professional washers. But for most people, if you wanted clean, you did it yourself or just accepted the funk. Fun fact, clean clothes mattered more than clean bodies. You could skip a bath for a month. But if your linen shirt was bright and smelled decent compared to the usual stench, you still looked respectable. For some, washing clothes was hygiene. After 14 chapters of rubbing, to scrubbing, sniffing, and surviving. The big question is, was medieval hygiene actually effective? Or were people just one dirty shirt away from spontaneous combustion? The short answer, it was okay. Ish, definitely not modern standards. If you time traveled back to 1347, your nose would file for divorce. But in their context, medieval folks weren't clueless about cleanliness. They just had a different definition of clean. They had systems, even if those systems included soaking feet in vinegar and tossing chamber pots out the window. They had tools, like lice combs, linen clothes, vinegar, herbs, and soap made from ashes. They had rituals too, whether it was sponge baths before Sunday Mass or boiling underwear under a full moon. Hygiene existed. It was just tangled up with fear, faith, sin, and the weather, in many ways. Medieval folks did their best with what they had, always trying not to anger God, the local lord, or their own pits. The idea of regular full-body baths was risky, time-consuming, and thanks to church rules and plague paranoia, considered medically unwise. So instead, they got creative, surprisingly. Some methods actually worked. Linen underwear stayed pretty clean. Herbal water and vinegar had decent antibacterial logic. Even public baths did their job, until they turned into hot gossip tubs full of syphilis. But yes, people smelled, scratched, shared bathwater, had lice and bad medical advice. Still, many lived to old age, or at least saw a second harvest despite the hygiene disasters. So, even if their standards were, let's say, flexible, they weren't total slobs. They made an effort. Hygiene back then was more social signaling than science. Clean clothes meant virtue. Shiny, or at least less itchy hair meant discipline. And not rotting alive was just basic manners. Basically, medieval hygiene was like balancing a cartwheel with rope, just enough to keep it rolling, but impressive when you peeked under the hood. Now, picture walking through a city over 4,000 years old, the ancient jewel of the Indus Valley civilization. If you imagine dusty straw huts and chaotic alleyways, think again. This place was so meticulously planned, it would make modern urban planners cry. Built around 2500 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro was no messy music festival campsite. This city was insanely well organized. Streets laid out in a grid, perfect squares and right angles all the way. Roads ran north-south, east-west, intersecting neatly to create a tidy network of streets. It's like the architects grabbed a ruler and said, "Let's keep it geometric, folks." But the genius wasn't just on the surface. Beneath those dusty streets was a system even 21st century cities sometimes can't handle drainage. Mohenjo-Daro had underground sewers. Almost every house, no matter how small, had its own water supply and drainage. Wastewater ran from homes into covered drains along the streets. It's like those ancient folks were whispering. Yeah, hygiene's kind of a big deal. This city wasn't just one giant brick-built toilet. It was purposefully zoned. There was a fortress on a high hill, probably for managers or priests, and residential areas down below. Public buildings like the famous Great Bath showed this was more than survival. It was ritual, even entertainment. Embedded in every clay brick Markets buzzed along main roads. Houses of all shapes and sizes showed social layers. Even tiny homes had wells and toilets. Think about that. Poorer folks had indoor plumbing 4,000 years ago. Meanwhile, many 19th century Europeans were still tossing trash out their windows. Then, mysteriously, the city was abandoned, no signs of invasion, no epic fires, just silence. Maybe climate change or trade disruptions did it in. But whatever the cause, Mohenjo-Daro's legacy remains a city built with intent, smarts, and a clear grasp that clean water and zoning laws matter, even though they didn't have urban planners. Who knew? If Mohenjo-Daro was the neat freak accountant of ancient cities, Babylon was the Hollywood star, flashy, sprawling, and dripping with legend. Babylon wasn't just a city, it was the symbol. It rose and fell more times than you've changed your mind. But at its peak around the 6th century BC, under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon was the sparkling heart of Mesopotamia. Don't let the poetic stuff fool you, this place was planned like a boss. Babylon had massive walls and grand gates, the most famous being the Ishtar Gate, decked out in bright blue glazed bricks and lion statues that look straight out of a dream. And nope, those lions weren't just for show. That gate was part of a carefully choreographed urban plan. At the center of Babylon's design was a sacred axis, a parade route slicing right through the city. Not your average street, this was the god's runway. Seriously, religious festivals like Akatu, the New Year Bash, marched down this very path, stretching from the giant Etmananki ziggurat, possibly the real Tower of Babel inspiration, to the grand temple of Marduk. Babylon's city plan was part devotion, part propaganda. You didn't just live in Babylon, you walked through its holy story every single day. Babylon's streets curved with the river and terrain but were zoned like a pro. Residential areas, temples, gardens, markets, and admin centers all had their place. The Euphrates River ran right through, not just for water, but for trade, and let's be honest, some serious bragging rights. Their sewage system was built, though not quite as fancy as the Indus valleys. Houses had toilets with clay pipes and drainage ditches that carried waste far away. Babylonian engineers were clearly no amateurs. They even stamped bricks with the king's name, because if you're building sewers, you might as well brand it like a designer label. Babylon was designed to wow both mortals and gods. Every street, every gate, every temple screamed, "Behold my masterpiece, mighty ones," and be amazed. And people were amazed. Even Alexander the Great supposedly planned to make Babylon his capital, because after strutting down a godly designed boulevard, Athens probably felt a bit muh. Around 1,000 years before the Aztecs admired the ruins here and named their own city Teotihuacan. This ancient city was already flexing its urban planning muscles. At its peak, around 500 AD, Teotihuacan was one of the world's largest cities, packed with over 100,000 people, unlike the messy modern cities we know. This place had a seriously precise map, like a geometry class that never forgot its ruler. The city's star feature, the Avenue of the Dead, yeah. The name sounds spooky. Thanks Aztecs, but it wasn't a graveyard. It was a ceremonial boulevard stretching over 2 miles. This grand avenue wasn't random. It was the central spine aligned to celestial events, flanked by temples, plazas, elite homes, and bustling markets. It connected the Moon Pyramid in the north to the giant Sun Pyramid, creating a sacred backbone shaping the whole city. Now here's the kicker. Teotihuacan's layout was super square. The entire city followed a grid tilted about 15 degrees, tilted 5 grader off true north, probably to line up with special celestial events or sacred mountains. Not an accident. This was cosmic urban planning. We're talking celestial compasses and zoning, spot on. Residential blocks were modular, often designed for multiple families, sharing courtyards and drainage. Some areas were decked out in fancy decor, showing off wealth, while others had a communal, working class vibe. This wasn't just a city, it was a society carved out in stone and mortar. Teotihuacan also had a complex water management system. Canals and drains ran along streets and through neighborhoods to stop flooding during rainy season. The engineers clearly knew their stuff and planned like pros. You get the feeling they'd be totally shocked by today's potholes. There's still a lot we don't know who ruled, how power worked, but one thing's clear: this city was built to impress both eyeballs and the sky. Teotihuacan was a blueprint of order, mixing ritual with reason. And when the Aztecs stumbled on the towering ruins centuries later, they didn't just admire it, they were pretty sure it was built by gods. Seriously, look at that symmetry. Who could complain when we talk about ancient urban planning? We usually picture a lone genius, some old-time city architect clutching blueprints and rocking mad foresight. But in the Indus Valley civilization, urban planning wasn't royal orders. It was a cultural consensus so strong that many cities across the region, from Harappa to Lothal, looked shockingly alike. They weren't just sister cities, they were architectural clones, and that says a lot. Here's a deep thought: Harappa, now in modern Pakistan, looks just like Mohenjo-daro, laid out in a neat grid with uniformly sized bricks, clear zones for industry, housing, administration, and, yes, you guessed it, a fancy sewage system. Every house hooked up to the drains via private pipes or underground clay conduits. This wasn't just hygiene, this was design reverence, making sure even the average Joe had clean facilities. Lothal, another city by the Arabian Sea, took it up a notch with actual port planning. Yeah, Lothal had a harbor, possibly the oldest port in the world, complete with a massive reservoir and water control gates. This wasn't some random riverside stop. It was a transport hub with infrastructure built to handle tides and currents. And you thought Venice was smart. What makes it even cooler: no palaces, no military forts, no power flex statues or victory plaques. Instead, these cities seemed run by efficient bureaucracies or councils focused on sanitation, trade, and rituals. Their power came from engineering, not empires. Artifacts like standardized weights and measures show a tightly controlled economy with separate market and craft zones. Imagine ancient city planners bickering over warehouse spots or drain widths, because these decisions mattered and lasted for hundreds of miles. And they didn't just build for the elite. The uniformity in housing, access to clean water, public amenities like baths and wells show a collective urban ideal, not class segregation. The real architects of these inner cities weren't just building towns, they were shaping societies where order seeped into every brick. And planning wasn't a privilege, it was a principle. When you think of zoning today, you picture officials squabbling over parking permits or whether Airbnb breaks housing rules. But zoning's splitting cities into living, working, worshiping. And trash zones isn't new. It's ancient and surprisingly common. Cities like Mohenjo-daro, Babylon, and Teotihuacan weren't random piles of buildings. They were carefully arranged spaces, each zone with its own logic. Back to Mohenjo-Daro. There, the high citadel had public baths, granaries, and maybe administrative buildings. Below were residential areas separated by wide avenues. Workshops and kilns were on the outskirts, probably because no one wanted their house full of pottery smoke and racket. Simple, sensible planning, but what's impressive is that this model repeated itself across Indus Valley cities. Now, let's hop over to Babylon. Babylon's planning wasn't just practical, it was ceremonial and propaganda. Temples and palaces dominated the city center, linked by ritual routes. Administrative buildings and elite homes clustered nearby, while common folk and markets spread out on the edges, but everyone lived under the same design philosophy, organized, purposeful, and genuinely sophisticated. Then there's Teotihuacan. Here, zoning was practically perfect down to the last detail. The city's layout followed a strict grid, but each area had its own clear identity. There were residential neighborhoods, craft production zones, marketplaces, and temple complexes all working like parts of a body. Some neighborhoods even housed immigrants, whole districts of Oaxaca people or Gulf folks, each built in their own traditional architectural style. That's regional planning with multicultural flair from 500 AD. This level of spatial order tells us one thing: this wasn't just a city. It was a deliberately crafted society. Urban space reflected values, whether spiritual, political, or economic. Where you lived, worked, worshipped, all pre-planned by someone who didn't just get human movement, but human connection. And no, they didn't need fancy GIS software, just observation, engineering, and maybe a sprinkle of divine orders. Because when a society can enforce zoning laws without angry tweets or lawsuits, you know they're playing urban planning way ahead of their time. People usually think the ancient world was a muddy, stinky mess, streets full of mud, one-pot toilets, and that special crowd smell from not bathing. But truth is, some ancient cities cared a lot about public hygiene. Actually, some places had public sanitation systems that would make 19th century Europeans blush. Let's go back to Mohenjo-Daro, our hygiene superstar. Almost every house, big or small, had its own bathing area, sloped floors for drainage. Wastewater flowed into street drains covered, tiled, and with maintenance holes for cleaning. Drains ran along nearly every street, hauling garbage out of the city. Basically, it was early urban plumbing. This, not just smart, but revolutionary too, compared to Babylon, where sanitation was mostly for show. The city had canals and some drainage ditches, clay pipes bringing water into palaces and temples. But for regular folks, well, sanitation meant cesspits, open gutters, and hoping the gods didn't mind. Still, toilets were common, and the rich got clay pipes inside their homes. Some records even mention a rudimentary flushing system, buckets and timing. Now, let's zoom in on Teotihuacan. While not as obsessed with drainage as the Indus Valley, Teotihuacan still boasted carefully designed rain channels and separate sewage for the wealthy neighborhoods. Lots of residential areas had indoor sewers, and public buildings often had their own toilets. Cleanliness wasn't just about comfort. It probably had religious purity vibes, especially in ritual spots like temples or the Avenue of the Dead. Even smaller ancient cities, like Lothal and Harappa, showed serious hydrosmarts with wells, reservoirs, and cleverly sloped streets to dodge floods. Imagine having to plan an entire town around gravity and monsoons and pulling it off in 2400 BC. What makes this all impressive isn't just the tech, it's the mindset. These civilizations saw water not just as a basic need, but something to channel, share, and respect. Sanitation wasn't a luxury for the elite. It was baked right into urban design. Modern cities still struggle with waste management, but these ancient folks dug ditches and laid bricks, quietly reminding us that clean water disposal is a full-on civilization achievement. If temples were where ancient people chatted with gods, markets were where they haggled and probably argued over onion prices. Every ancient city we've uncovered had a booming economic heart, beating through carefully planned marketplaces, trade routes, and clear economic zoning in Babylon. Markets weren't messy afterthoughts squeezed between temples. They were institutionalized, woven into the urban fabric, and regulated by law. The Hammurabi Code, one of the oldest legal texts, dedicates dozens of rules to trade, weights, and merchant behavior. Bustling markets thrived under canopies and open squares. Wheat, cloth, wine, slaves, and livestock changed hands while clerks kept neat records of debts and deals. This wasn't just shopping, it was commerce with legal scaffolding. Now, shift to Teotihuacan, where things get even more interesting. The city had massive market plazas, especially near the Ciudadela, where thousands gathered to trade obsidian, cacao, feathers, pottery, and salt. Unlike some cultures with highly centralized temple economies, Teotihuacan's markets seemed decentralized and community-run, with neighborhoods specializing in their own crafts. Think of it like an ancient Etsy, except your supplier lives next door. Meanwhile, in Mohenjo-Daro and other Indus Valley spots with wide avenues and nearby warehouses, archaeologists found standardized scales and weights, indicating pretty tight control systems. Goods from as far as Mesopotamia, like seals and precious stones, show up in Indus sites, proving international trade was a thing. Imagine your local fishmonger accepting Mesopotamian money without batting an eye. But it wasn't just about cash. Markets were social hubs too. In Babylon, they were gossip central, dispute courts, and fashion runways for the latest Assyrian tunics. In Teotihuacan, markets were multicultural melting pots with merchants and travelers from everywhere, all gathering by the pyramids. Even Indus cities, lacking flashy palaces or temples, prioritized economic zones in their layouts. Trade drove innovation. It demanded roads, rules, and record keeping. Ancient urban planners responded not with chaos, but with order. Behind every sacred temple or fortress wall was a merchant shouting, "Best prices in town in the ancient world." Urban planning wasn't just about sewers and markets, it was about the gods. Temples didn't hide in quiet corners, they dominated skylines, perched atop the city's highest points, demanding prime real estate. If markets were the city's heartbeat, temples were its soul, and ancient planners made sure everyone got the memo. Starting with Babylon, the skyline pierced by the Ziggurat et Menanke, a multi-tiered brick mountain dedicated to the god Marduk. This wasn't some tiny shrine, it was an architectural flex about 300 feet tall, according to ancient sources. It was meant to link heaven and earth. This wasn't just spirituality, it was a message of urban centralization. Streets led straight to it, ceremonies revolved around it, and the whole city bowed architecturally and ritually to this sacred hub. Teotihuacan also placed its spiritual heart front and center. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon weren't just ritual sites, they were urban axes. The Avenue of the Dead connected these temples like a celestial highway, aligned with astronomical events and possibly solstice celebrations. Neighborhoods and markets seemed to radiate outward from these temples. They weren't just background scenery, they were cosmic coordinates guiding both people and philosophy. Then there's Mohenjo-Daro, no towering ziggurats or pyramids. But it did have the Great Bath, a huge public pool possibly used for ritual purification. This isn't just a swimming pool, it's waterproof brickwork, a fancy drainage system, and probably tied to some spiritual rituals about cleanliness and rebirth. No idol temples around here, just water, geometry, and silence in all these cities. Sacred spaces weren't just slapped anywhere, they were carefully placed and had a purpose. Temples didn't stand alone, they connected to festival streets, public squares, and admin centers. Worship wasn't separate from life, it was life urban planning, baby. This shows their unity. It wasn't a secular society with temples stuck in corners. It was a sacred landscape dressed up as a city, every brick laid down, every road sliced through, every plaza placed was part of a bigger spiritual dance, because in the ancient world, building a city was offering a gift, and the gods always snagged the best seat in the house. We like to think modern cities popped out of innovation, blueprints, and engineers. But dig a little deeper, really, and you'll see the urban backbone was set thousands of years ago by planners who had no concrete, bulldozers, or K&E software, the DNA of city planning: street grids, zoning, sanitation, public centers, religious spaces was carved into the earth by folks we often overlook. Like the drainage system, Mohenjo-Daro didn't just dig a few ditches. They designed a multi-level sewage network running through houses and under streets. Universal access to sanitation, still a pipe dream in some places today, was standard in this Bronze Age city. Babylon laid the groundwork for regulated trade, public infrastructure, and using symbolic space to reinforce power and religion. Teotihuacan gave us the cosmic city blueprint where every road, plaza, and temple pointed to something bigger than the eye could see. The builders linked astronomy with architecture, weaving celestial rhythms into daily life. This wasn't just a settlement, it was a philosophical blueprint. Then there's the psychological side. Ancient cities shaped behavior, wide avenues for parades and festivals, enclosed courtyards creating community spaces. Zoning wasn't just practical, it shaped how people interacted, how neighborhoods formed, and how power was displayed. These choices told folks where to gather, what was sacred, and how to live in harmony, or at least try to. Modern urban planning owes a lot to this ancient vision: Manhattan's grid, Amsterdam's sanitation, temples turned churches, then town halls. The idea of public centers also comes from ancestral cityscapes. We still measure land, still design cities around access, commerce, spirituality, and spectacle. Only technology changes. The principles stay the same. And while we lay asphalt and raise skyscrapers, the core is unchanged. A city is a story we write in stone, brick, and steel. The first chapters of that story were carved with bronze tools, planned by stargazing maps, and maintained by people who believed good living needed good planning. So next time you stroll down the street, remember you're not just walking through space, you're stepping through 4,000 years of ideas, whispering beneath your feet. Hadrian wasn't born in the heart of Rome, but out in its far western suburbs. He popped into the world in 76 AD in Italica, a Romanized town in the province of Hispania Baetica that's modern southern Spain. Despite being far from the capital, Hadrian's family wasn't some backwater bumpkins. They were wealthy, cultured, and totally Roman elites. Most importantly, his dad's side was blood related to Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, the guy who'd later become Emperor Trajan. Hadrian lost both parents around age 10, a tragedy that shaped his life and landed him under the wing of Trajan and Publius Acilius Attianus, a Roman knight. These two basically steered his life, while many young nobles were pushed towards military or political careers. Hadrian leaned into Greek literature, philosophy, and the arts. He spoke fluent Greek, marinated himself in Homer, and preferred scrolls over swords, at least at first. Of course, Rome didn't run on poetry, so Hadrian, like any ambitious Roman noble, had to earn his spot through service. He started as a military officer in Lower Moesia, then Upper Moesia, and finally Pannonia. Hadrian proved capable as an officer, but his real talent was management and politics. Trajan's rise to emperor in 98 AD was a turning point for Hadrian. Despite some tense moments, Hadrian was known for being sharp, arrogant, and a bit too intellectual for some. Trajan kept him close. Hadrian became quaestor, then tribune of the plebs, gradually climbing Rome's political ladder, the cursus honorum. He also snagged a fancy wife, Vibia Sabina, Trajan's granddaughter, a politically strategic marriage, but probably not a love story. The marriage was likely loveless and distant because Hadrian preferred philosopher buddies and close relationships with men, especially Antinous, whom he later adored. Hadrian's early life was shaped by tension between military expectations and his artist's soul. He came from the empire's edge but was destined to lead it not with brute force, but calculated charm. In a world obsessed with conquest, the man dreamed of marble pillars and deep philosophical chats. When Emperor Trajan got seriously sick in 117 AD, the question of who'd take over became urgent and a total mess. Even though Hadrian had been orbiting the royal scene for ages, not everyone bought into his claim to the throne. Trajan never publicly named an heir, and the political elite were split on whether Hadrian the Cold, brainy guy from Hispania, was Rome's best bet. Trajan died in Selinus, Asia Minor, far from the capital. Convenient or suspicious, and just days later, a letter arrived in Rome claiming Trajan had adopted Hadrian on his deathbed, with Trajan's wife Plotina and loyal Attianus as witnesses. Perfect timing, right? Some senators whispered fake news, while others suspected Plotina had pulled strings, favoring Hadrian's brain over military hotshots. Either way, the Senate gave Hadrian the thumbs up, crowning him emperor on August 11th, 117 AD. But this handoff wasn't smooth sailing. Hadrian immediately faced a crisis. The empire was drained dry from Trajan's wars, especially in Mesopotamia, where rebellions were popping off. Instead of doubling down on expansion, Hadrian went practical and unpopular by pulling back from Trajan's eastern conquests, including Armenia and Mesopotamia. Senators and soldiers who'd bled for those wins were livid. Hadrian got slapped with cowardice and even betrayal charges. Then the bloodshed started right after stepping up. 4 famous senators who openly opposed Hadrian were executed on vague conspiracy charges. Hadrian denied involvement, blaming Attianus, but nobody bought it. This move left a permanent stain on his relationship with the Senate. Even though Hadrian tried to rule with restraint and law, the message was clear. Hadrian might philosophize like a Greek, but he'd rule like a Roman, despite the political chaos. His first acts as emperor revealed his priorities. He canceled debts, handed out cash to the poor, and kept the army loyal with generous bonuses. Broke the endless conquest treadmill and started focusing Roman energy on shoring up, building infrastructure, and stabilizing. Hadrian might have grabbed the throne through backroom whispers and shady signatures, but once emperor, he didn't waste time making the empire his own. He wasn't one to lounge around in Rome's marble halls. Unlike most emperors, he saw the empire not as a vague idea but a living, breathing land, and he decided to walk it. As soon as he took the throne, Hadrian kicked off tours to nearly every province under his rule. This wasn't just pomp, it was hands-on management, inspections, tweaks, diplomacy, and vision all packed into sandals and sweat. Over the next 2 decades, Hadrian logged more miles than any emperor before or after. His first big trip started in 121 AD and lasted almost 5 years. He trekked through Gaul, Germania, Britannia, Hispania, Africa, the Balkans, Greece, and Asia Minor, not in a fancy carriage, but mostly on foot with his soldiers. It was leadership and a show. In Britannia, Hadrian saw firsthand the northern border chaos. The Caledonian tribes, ancestors of the Scots, kept stirring trouble. Rome had pushed too far, and Hadrian chose to retreat and fortify. This decision birthed his most famous legacy, Hadrian's Wall, a 73-mile stone barrier cutting across northern England. It wasn't just military, it was psychological, a big no trespassing sign. Rome would defend what it had, not greedily grab more. In Africa, he inspected forts and improved infrastructure. In Asia Minor, he funded public works and temples. In Egypt, he was worshipped like a living god and almost drowned in the Nile. Wherever he went, he glued the empire together with his presence, policies, and construction money. But his favorite stop was always Greece. Hadrian was obsessed with Hellenic culture, the language, philosophy, and aesthetics. He joined the secret Eleusinian rituals, funded philosophers, and earned the nickname Graculus in his youth. Not offended he wore that title like a badge of honor. In Athens, he sponsored the completion of the Temple of Olympian Zeus, kicked off Hadrian's library, and tried to revive the Panhellenic League, uniting Greek cities through cultural pride. His trips were no vacation. They were governance in action. By showing up in every corner of the empire, Hadrian reminded provinces they weren't forgotten. He wasn't just an emperor in Rome, he was an emperor on every road, in every market, inspecting temples and getting his boots dusty with them. Hadrian didn't just walk the empire, he rebuilt it in stone. He was a building maniac, not just for politics. His reign marked a golden age of imperial architecture, where concrete and marble became tools of philosophy, power, and cultural mashup. Wherever he went, Hadrian left arches, aqueducts, baths, theaters, and temples, not just monuments, but blueprints for a unified empire. His most iconic contribution, right in Rome, the Pantheon, rebuilt on his orders around 126 AD. The previous one, courtesy of Agrippa, had burned down. But Hadrian's vision turned it into one of the longest-lasting buildings in history, with its massive dome and open skylight. The Pantheon became a Roman engineering marvel and a symbol of heaven touching earth. It was religious, geometric, cosmic, and totally Hadrian. Then there's his villa at Tivoli, a sprawling complex east of Rome, part getaway, part laboratory, unlike your average royal pad. Hadrian's villa was an architectural mixtape. It recreated famous landmarks, across the Empire Egyptian columns, Greek walkways, even a mini Nile canal. This wasn't just a villa. It was the dream of a philosopher king, a bold statement that Rome ruled every corner of the known world. In the provinces, he launched massive infrastructure projects. In Athens, he finished the temple of Olympian Zeus and revived a centuries-old abandoned project in North Africa. Hadrian funded roads, aqueducts, and granaries in Asia and the Levant. He rebuilt cities shattered by earthquakes. In Jerusalem, he sparked outrage by rebranding the city as Aelia Capitolina, pissing off the Jewish population, a move with long-lasting consequences. Hadrian's architectural style was as eclectic as his travels. He loved arches, symmetry, and domes, but also blended Greek aesthetics, Egyptian motifs, and local materials. He didn't impose Roman identity on the provinces. He wove their traditions into the imperial fabric. For Hadrian, architecture wasn't just about function or beauty. It was philosophy carved in stone, a silent way of saying Rome wasn't just a place, it was an idea. And here's that idea, bricks a brick. Hadrian didn't just preserve the empire, he shaped its soul. Among the many companions on Hadrian's journeys, none left a more emotional mark than Antinous, a stunning young man from Bithynia, Asia. Their relationship, gentle, controversial, and ultimately tragic, became the emperor's personal legend and sparked one of history's most intriguing stories. Antinous first showed up in Hadrian's life around 124 AD, probably as his young sidekick. Ancient sources say he was so ridiculously handsome, he stunned everyone silent, obedient, and basically Hadrian's favorite. He followed the emperor on tours across the empire, especially Greece and Egypt. Their bond, never officially recognized, was widely seen as romantic in a society where the emperor ruled relationships with an iron fist. Hadrian and Antinous' was notable for its intensity and openness, but in 130 AD, tragedy struck. While boating on the Nile, Antinous mysteriously drowned. Details are murky, some say accident, others whisper ritual sacrifice, and there's even suicide gossip. Whatever the truth, Hadrian was devastated. He publicly mourned his companion like no Roman emperor before him. His grief was raw, intense, and long-lasting. What followed was one of the most extraordinary royal memorials ever. Hadrian deified Antinous. He founded a city near the drowning spot, Antinopolis, and set up cults worshipping him throughout the empire. Hundreds of statues of the guy were made. His image, always idealized and serene, became the new symbol of divine beauty and youthful perfection. Temples, coins, festivals, even oracles were dedicated to Antinous. In many ways, he morphed into a sort of pagan saint, the god of pain, rebirth, and masculine beauty. No royal lover had ever been honored like this before, and for Hadrian, it wasn't just political theater, it was a personal myth carved in marble. Across continents, the cult of Antinous outlived Hadrian by ages. His statues lasted longer than the empire. His name echoed in poetry and travelers' tales through Antinous. Hadrian didn't just immortalize love, he challenged the empire's ideas about what divinity even meant. Hadrian's reign, often tied to art, philosophy, and globe-trotting, wasn't short on fiery drama, and no flame burned hotter than the Bar Kokhba revolt, the most violent Jewish uprising against Roman rule. This revolt tested the emperor's patience, revealed his ruthless side, and left deep scars on Judea. The rebellion seed was planted when Hadrian, trying to unify the empire under Roman civic religion. Renamed Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina after his family and worshipped Jupiter there. Even worse. Rumor has it he planned a temple to Jupiter right on the ruins of the Second Temple, Judaism's holiest site, whether by accident or provocation. The Jews saw it as the ultimate insult. In 132 AD, the revolt exploded under Simon Bar Kokhba, a charismatic, fiery leader hailed by some as the Messiah. His forces quickly crushed Roman garrisons and reclaimed Jerusalem, setting up a short-lived Jewish state for 2 years. Bar Kokhba ruled like a legit prince, minting coins and enforcing Jewish law. Hadrian, initially caught off guard, responded with cold fury and strategy. He called in his best generals, including Julius Severus from Britain, and marshaled overwhelming forces. What followed was a brutal anti-rebellion war. The Romans crushed villages one by one, using scorched earth tactics, sieges, and mass executions. No mercy for rebels or civilians suspected of helping them. By 135 AD, the revolt was crushed. Bar Kokhba was dead. Judea lay in ruins. Roman sources claim over 500,000 Jews died, with countless others enslaved. Judea was renamed Syria Palestina, a deliberate erasure of Jewish ties to the land. Jewish religious activities were restricted, and people scattered. Hadrian, the emperor of architecture and elegance, showed his iron fist. His rule in Judea is one of the darkest chapters, not about roads or domes, but fire, ashes, and exile, a harsh reminder that Hadrian could love paperwork, gods, and boys. But when challenged, he ruled with Roman steel. After years of restless roaming, building huge stuff, juggling diplomacy and brutality, Hadrian finally started to slow down. His final chapter was all about illness, gloom, and that sinking feeling that even an emperor can't cheat death. The guy who once toured the entire empire, Hadrian now rarely left his villa, turning into a hermit philosopher king, moody and withdrawn. By 133 AD, he had a chronic illness, maybe heart failure or kidney trouble. Ancient reports of swelling, weakness, and breathlessness say he got cranky, depressed, and obsessed with his own mortality. He started writing gloomy poetry about life's limits. One famous line is a whispered farewell to his soul, a Nimala Vagala Blandala, capturing life's fragility and power's limits. But as his body failed, he still had one last emperor job, picking an heir. Hadrian had no kids, and his political instincts were tangled with personal feelings. In 136 AD, he adopted Lucius Saeonius Commodus, aka Lucius alias Caesar, a rather obscure senator known more for charm than health. People were puzzled. This guy was stylish, kinda soft, and clearly not emperor material. Their doubts were spot on. Just months after adoption, Aelius suddenly dropped dead, probably tuberculosis. Hadrian was crushed and scrambled to find a better heir, running out of time. He went traditional Titus Aurelius Antoninus, a respected steady senator. In 138 AD, Hadrian adopted Antoninus, but with a twist. Antoninus had to adopt Marcus Annius Verus, the young guy who'd become Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. That single move set the stage for 2 generations of solid leadership, but it didn't ease his pain. Hadrian retreated to his beloved villa in Tivoli, spending his last days haunted by memories, statues, and shadows of Antoninus. As he worsened, he tried suicide multiple times, but was always stopped by servants. He died in July 138 AD, aged 62. His ashes were placed in his self-built mausoleum, a towering pillar by the Tiber River. Later known as Castel Sant'Angelo, he didn't leave an empire bigger, but one safer, more united, and smarter than ever before. Back in the capital, his Pantheon rebuild changed architectural history. That giant concrete dome was once the biggest in the world, more than a temple to gods. It was a flex of Roman engineering and imagination. The Pantheon was Hadrian's brain, made stone precise, timeless, and open to the sky, his Tivoli villa, with its library, water gardens, and temples, became the Renaissance palace blueprint centuries later. It was Hadrian's world dream, an empire shrunk down to art and landscape. But Hadrian's legacy wasn't just carved in stone, it was etched deep into policy and precedent. He reformed Roman law, reorganized the army without constant wars, and professionalized provincial management. He toured provinces not to show off, but to understand them, leaving a new model of imperial responsibility culturally. His love for Greek philosophy, poetry, and sculpture revived Hellenic traditions empire-wide. The guy once mocked as Graculus actually Hellenized Rome, not by force, but with style, politically. Hadrian's choice of Antoninus Pius and adoption of Marcus Aurelius set off an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity, later called the Pax Antoniniana. His vision birthed the Five Good Emperors, a golden age of stability in Roman history. Yet he was a walking paradox, a builder who destroyed Judea, a peace lover with a hidden iron fist, a beauty fan who ruled with ruthless pragmatism. Hadrian's Rome wasn't just marble and power, it was brains, memory, and balance. He didn't just rule Rome, he redefined what being an emperor meant. His reign stood at the crossroads of military command and philosophical quest, tradition and innovation in many ways. Hadrian marked a turning point. The Roman emperor wasn't just a warlord anymore, but a guardian of civilization. Unlike predecessors, Hadrian showed power through presence, not conquest walking roads, visiting forts, inspecting aqueducts, debating philosophers. He turned emperorship into a performance of omnipresent responsibility. The toga and scroll became as mighty as the sword. This shift changed how later emperors saw their roles. His immediate successors, Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, embraced this vision. They ruled not as conquerors, but as caretakers of Roman order, focusing on justice, infrastructure, and cultural refinement. Marcus Aurelius, with his Meditations, might never have happened if Hadrian hadn't made philosophy emperor-worthy. Hadrian embodied power's contradictions, loved yet feared, refined yet ruthless when provoked. His reign was mostly peaceful, but beneath that calm lay autocratic reflexes, executions of senators, crushing the Bar Kokhba revolt, kicking out the troublemakers. This guy preached moderation, but ruled with the subtlety of a butcher's knife. When challenged behind closed doors, Hadrian turned brooding and gloomy. His poetry, especially in old age, reveals a dude painfully aware of his own limits and contradictions. His love for Antinous idealized, deified, and mourned was the emotional anchor to his public persona. That pain humanized him, echoing through centuries as a rare glimpse of an emperor's vulnerability. Even in death, Hadrian left behind a legacy that refused to fade. His tomb, now Rome's Castel Sant'Angelo, stands like a fortress against oblivion. His buildings shape the skyline. His laws inspired generations. His travels stitched a multicultural empire into something that actually felt unified, at least for a while. Hadrian's greatness wasn't about conquering lands, but about preserving building and imagining. He was a walking paradox with a laurel-crowned architect and dictator, poet and emperor, man and mystery. In the end, Hadrian didn't just leave monuments, he left an emperor's blueprint, a mold that still haunts Rome's ruins and the minds of those who wander them. Fast forward to 1803, President Thomas Jefferson doubled America's size with just a pen stroke, the Louisiana Purchase, a $15 million deal with France, added over 800,000 square miles of wild, unexplored territory to the young republic, a geopolitical win, sure, but also a giant weight. What did we just buy on the map? Mountains, deserts, water routes, monsters. Jefferson had zero clue, but he was determined to find out. Enter Meriwether Lewis, Jefferson's private secretary, adventure junkie, and relentless scientific note-taker. Jefferson picked him to lead the expedition to explore the new land, map it out, document plants and animals, and most importantly, check if the legendary Northwest Passage to the Pacific Ocean actually existed. Lewis didn't go solo, though. He chose his old buddy and army pal, William Clark, as co-leader, while Lewis brought scientific smarts and diplomacy. Clark brought military discipline, mapping skills, and a knack for making friends exactly the balance Jefferson thought necessary. They'd co-lead as equals, even if only Lewis had the official rank. Their teamwork became one of the expedition's biggest strengths. They set off immediately. Jefferson's orders were clear: observe the land, trade with native tribes, study plants and animals, and stake America's claim in lands long home to dozens of indigenous nations. Their diplomacy came wrapped in scientific curiosity. They packed everything: compasses, sextants, microscopes, gifts for native chiefs like beads, mirrors, peace medals, and even a folding iron frame boat, which never quite worked, but sounded impressive on paper. Dozens of men, mostly from the U.S. Army, joined up. This crew became the expedition's core, an ambitious name for an ambitious trip. They left Camp Dubois near St. Louis in May 1804, ahead thousands of unknown miles, countless tribes, and a mission with no guarantee of return. But for Jefferson, Lewis, and Clark, the prize wasn't just land, it was knowledge, the kind that would change America's future and shape its frontier spirit. So with blank maps and fresh journals, the expedition plunged into the wilderness, chasing a hazy dream only Jefferson seemed to see. On May 14th, 1804, the expedition's corps set off from the Missouri River, beginning a 2-year journey into lands few Americans had ever seen. They left quietly, no parties, no cheering crowds, just 33 people on a keelboat and 2 pirogues, hauling nearly 10 tons of gear downstream into the wild. Progress was slow. The Missouri River, the main highway west, was a nightmare. Shifting sandbars, fierce currents, and thick forests made every inch a daily struggle. They used poles, ropes, paddles, and sheer stubbornness to inch upstream. Sometimes it probably felt like paddling through wet cement. The team was a mix of tough border soldiers, seasoned hunters, French-Canadian boatmen, and some rough but determined soldiers. Among them was York, Clark's black servant, whose strength and charm earned deep respect from native tribes, and Charles Floyd, a sergeant whose fate later reminded everyone just how fragile life on the frontier really was. The team quickly settled into discipline. Clark, the top-notch mapmaker, recorded every twist and turn of the river. Lewis, the naturalist, cataloged plants, animals, geology, taking detailed notes from catfish to mosquitoes. Every day brought new creatures, some majestic like bald eagles and moose, others less charming mosquitoes, ticks, and fly bites became a daily nightmare. By late summer, they reached what's now Iowa and South Dakota, endless grasslands and skies so blue it hurts. Here, they had their first real diplomatic run-ins with native tribes Omaha in Missouri. Then the Teton Sioux. Things were tense, though Lewis and Clark showed up with peace medals and flags, America's way of saying, hey, we come in peace, but also, we mean business. The message was clear: a new nation had arrived, wanting to be noticed, but underneath the smiles, suspicion was thick. The expedition was usually outnumbered and outgunned. Diplomacy wasn't just polite talk, it was survival. One wrong move, and boom, disaster still. With brute strength, teamwork, and some smooth talking. They pushed on down the river. Winter hadn't hit yet, but the vibe was set. This trip demanded grit, humility, and guts. And the Missouri River, it was just getting warmed up. By fall 1804, stretching across the Great Plains, the Missouri started slowing down under the weight of the coming winter. They'd traveled over 1,000 miles from St. Louis and knew they couldn't reach the Rocky Mountains before snow cut off the westward path. Or got time to stop, regroup, and survive. They picked a spot near today's Washburn, North Dakota, just downstream from the Mandan and Hidatsa villages. These native communities had long-standing, sturdy earth lodges along the river with rich farming, complex societies, and prime locations. The Mandan were seasoned diplomats, host to French, British, and Spanish traders. Americans, just weird hat-wearing newbies. Here, Lewis and Clark ordered the building of a winter fort, Fort Mandan, named after their hosts. It rose from frozen grasslands, like a wooden declaration they were here to stay, at least until spring, built from cottonwood logs. The fort had high walls, blocky houses, and cramped rooms for over 30 people. It wasn't exactly cozy, but it blocked the fierce, biting wind witch. Trust me, out here is downright savage. Temperatures regularly dropped below degrees. Frostbite was a daily threat. Yet life at Fort Mandan was anything but boring. Lewis and Clark were obsessed with note-taking everything from temps to tribal languages, down to counting kernels on an ear of corn. Most importantly, it was here they met Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trapper, and his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. Though Charbonneau was hired as an interpreter, the real MVP was Sacagawea, pregnant at the time, who'd become an irreplaceable guide in the months ahead. Her knowledge of Western geography and ability to communicate with native tribes proved more valuable than muskets or maps. Relations with the Mandan were mostly peaceful, though tensions flared now and then. Cultural misunderstandings, scarce resources, and the crush of close quarters made conflict almost unavoidable. But the expedition knew without native cooperation, their trip could end buried in snow. By spring 1805, with packed journals, repaired gear, and Sacagawea's newborn son, Jean-Baptiste, snugly bundled, they tore down Fort Mandan. The next leg into unknown plains and toward the Rockies was about to begin. In April 1805, the expedition left the relative safety of Fort Mandan and plunged back into the wild unknown. They traveled lighter, in a smaller group, and with more urgency. Winter was over. Ahead lay mountains, unmapped rivers, and Jefferson's haunting question, was there a water route to the Pacific Spring, brought beauty? Sure, but also torture mosquitoes hungry enough to drive anyone mad. The Missouri swarmed with them, buzzing annoyingly all day. Sleep nope. Mosquitoes had other plans. Bison, deer, and bears were plenty. But sunburns, swollen bites, and relentless humidity were just as brutal. Lewis recorded everything in his journal, mixing scientific curiosity with a touch of weary endurance. This stretch nearly brought their first disaster when a pirogue, a fancy canoe, flipped. Sacagawea calmly saved the crucial stuff Clark's journal and maps, earning even more respect from the guys. She wasn't just the translator, she was their rock cool under pressure, adaptable, and insanely capable. By June, the team reached the Great Missouri Falls, not just one, but a chain of 5 waterfalls stretching 18 miles. A breathtaking natural wonder turned nightmare when they had to haul boats. The crew spent nearly a month dragging canoes and gear over steep cliffs and jagged terrain, using homemade carts and pure muscle power. Some called this the worst physical challenge of the whole trip. Still, spirits lifted when Lewis spotted the snow-capped Rockies. In the distance, that moment was both inspiring and terrifying. They thought the Rockies would be as gentle as the Appalachians. Nope. These towering peaks would soon crush hopes of a continuous water route to the Pacific. But hope came from the Shoshone-Sacagawea's people when the expedition finally made contact. An incredible reunion happened. The chief who showed up was Sacagawea's brother. That moment, equal parts lucky and legendary, changed everything. The Shoshone agreed to provide horses, food, and crucial guidance for crossing the Bitterroot Mountains, where boats simply couldn't go. The Missouri had brought them this far, and now the limits hit. Now the real mountain climbing begins. Crossing the Rocky Mountains was never a walk in the park, but even the worst predictions didn't prepare the expedition for the brutal Bitterroot Range, leaving the Missouri River behind and the Pacific still way out there. They had to ditch the boats and ride horses, hauling whatever they could on narrow, freezing trails with horses and their Shoshone guide. They started tackling the Bitterroots in early September 1805. The terrain absolutely savaged sharp peaks, sheer cliffs, and dense forests, turning every step into a battle. Trails were often just animal paths through fog, snow, and howling winds. But the worst enemy, hunger. These guys had to eat candle soup made from bear fat and even horse meat. Their journals from this time read like a grim menu of what's edible and what's just desperate chewing. People were dropping from exhaustion, moccasins falling apart, and frostbite creeping into fingers and toes. The worst part was Lolo Pass, where the group shuffled through piles of snow, gnawing on boiled roots and ripped up animal skins. Clark wrote they were totally out of food, barely surviving on horse meat. This was the absolute physical low point of the trip, and yet they didn't quit. When they finally escaped the mountains near today's Idaho, they ran into the Nez Perce tribe's land. The Nez Perce could have wiped them out, but instead took care of the starving. Ragged group, feeding them fish and guiding them, even helping build dugout canoes to continue westward across the river. Once again, luck smiled, a reminder that it wasn't just American grit, but native hospitality that made this miracle happen, resting with the Nez Perce. Lewis and Clark reflected on what lay ahead. They were tired, frostbitten, and starving, but now close to the Columbia River basin, and that meant one thing: the Pacific Ocean was near. But the worst wasn't over. Rivers remained wild, weather unpredictable, and winter closing in, leaving the Rockies behind. With winter approaching, the expedition started crafting dugout canoes from towering ponderosa pines, thanks to the Nez Perce's help. Their next target was the Columbia River, the big river that would take them west to the Pacific, the end point of this grueling, endless journey. But if they thought paddling would be easier than mountain climbing, oh boy, were they in for a wet and violent reality check? The Columbia wasn't your lazy Sunday river. It was fast, rocky, moody, and seemed to want to drown them at every turn. The boats were heavy and unstable, especially loaded with gear, journals, specimens, and people. All exhausted, dangerous rapids threatened to flip the boats and swallow their precious cargo. More than once, they nearly died. Lucky reflexes and a good dose of luck kept them from losing everything. Along the way, they met Chinookan and Ensahaptan tribes, wealthy societies bustling with trade, especially salmon. So much salmon, it was like an all-you-can-eat buffet swimming past their noses. The expedition was wowed by their fishing skills, carved wooden houses, and insanely detailed dugout canoes. These tribes were smart, experienced, and didn't trust strangers easily. Negotiations had to be smooth and careful. Some tribes welcomed the strangers, others saw them as uninvited invaders. The further west they went, closer to native worlds, the environment changed. Rain poured like it had a personal vendetta. The lush forests of Washington and Oregon were beautiful, sure, but cold, damp, and relentless. Clothes got moldy. Gunpowder wouldn't fire. And Lewis and Clark's journals read like grim diaries from a soggy hellscape. Finally, in mid-November 1805, after 18 months of hardship, the group reached the Columbia River's mouth. Through gray mist and storms, they saw the Pacific Ocean for the first time. You'd think they'd be over the moon, but nope, not a romantic moment. Their camp near today's Astoria, Oregon, was a muddy, windy, miserable mess. They named it Fort Clatsop, where they'd endure a long, wet winter cold. Sickly and flea-ridden, days were spent making moccasins, boiling venison, and writing endless journal entries. They'd made it. But the harshest truth stared them down. They still had to go back. Reaching the Pacific in November 1805 should have been the expedition's crowning glory. But the ocean didn't care. Rain poured nonstop, freezing temps hit hard, and relentless coastal storms turned their reward into a soggy, muddy nightmare. Reluctantly, they set up a rough shelter on the south bank of the Columbia, naming it Fort Clatsop after the local Clatsop tribe. The winter of 1805-1806 was brutal. It rained almost every day, except for 12 according to Clark's notes. Their clothes rotted, fleas and lice spread like wildfire, and scurvy lurked nearby. Deer, their main food source, had to be hunted daily, often miles from camp. The meat was tough, dry, just enough to keep their bodies and spirits from collapsing. Still, Lewis and Clark stubbornly kept writing. They carefully documented tribal customs, geography, weather, plants, and animals, adding hundreds of pages to the scientific treasure trove. Lewis got detailed about sea otters. Clark kept refining the maps, who later became the GPS for countless settlers. Despite the misery, these folks were serious observers. Their dance with the local tribes, oh, all kinds of drama. The Clatsop and Chinook were savvy traders with ancient coastal hookup networks. Polite, sure, enthusiastic about the expedition's presence, not so much. Food and supply deals were more like brutal haggling matches than warm welcomes. Unlike the Mandan or Nez Perce, these coastal tribes believed in no freebies, and they didn't hide their impatience when the Americans brought crappy goods, trade goods, and then the inevitable boredom, trapped in a soaking wet wooden fort, waiting for clear skies. The guys killed time by salting stuff, fixing clothes, and carving lame wooden souvenirs. Spirits hit rock bottom. Sickness spread like wildfire. Even Lewis, normally the sharp scientist, turned grumpy and shy. By March 1806, the expedition was totally over it, with journals full, specimens preserved, and bodies stiff from misery. They blew out the last candle at Fort Clatsop, packed up whatever hadn't rotted, and faced east. They had found the Pacific Ocean. Now came the real test to surviving the brutal, long trek back to civilization. No more wow, New World excitement, just painful memories of every grueling step ahead. March 1806. The expedition left Fort Clatsop soaked, exhausted, and laser-focused on one goal: going home. They'd done what no American had before walked to the Pacific, but the return trip promised to be just as savage, even crueler, and in many ways, way more complicated. The wilderness they'd once stepped into with curiosity now had a totally different vibe, familiar, but unforgiving. They pushed upriver on the Columbia, battling fierce currents, sheer cliffs, intense run-ins with local tribes. Supplies ran low, trading got tough. The Chinook and other coastal tribes grew even warier, probably sensing the American arrival spelled unwanted change. By late spring, the expedition had crossed the Bitterroot Mountains back into friendlier weather and better preps, though still facing a brutal challenge. When they hit the Nez Perce villages, they were welcomed like old pals. The tribe had kept their horses safe as promised and helped gear up for the next leg. Then Lewis and Clark made a risky call, split up into smaller groups to explore more ground. Lewis headed north to the Marias River, hoping to link it to the Missouri and push the U.S. boundaries. Clark followed the Yellowstone River, documenting and scouting easier plains routes. Talk about a bold move. Communication between groups was zero, and Lewis's path nearly turned deadly. Late July, Lewis's crew ran into Blackfeet warriors who seemed chill at first, but got suspicious once they spotted American guns and trade goods. One tense night exploded into violence. 2 Blackfeet died in the only bloodshed caused by the expedition. Lewis's group fled into the darkness. Panicked and wounded, Clark's crew had a less dramatic return, though they still took injuries and got chased by a herd of bison. They launched boats and met back up with Sacagawea and her family, steering down the Yellowstone River without much hassle. By August 1806, the 2 groups reunited near the Missouri River. The expedition was whole again, but the mood was quiet. The thrill of discovery was gone. It was time for the final paddle home, tired, scarred, but alive. By late August, the Missouri River carried the expedition downstream, this time heading home, no longer a mystery, skinnier, ragged clothes, mud-smeared journals, but they survived. On September 23rd, 1806, the group finally returned to St. Louis, as not with fanfare, but stunned silence. Most folks thought they were dead. Over 2 years, Lewis and Clark covered 8,000 miles, crossed mountains, swam wild rivers, met over 50 native tribes, and documented hundreds of new plants and animals. They mapped a huge chunk of the continent with jaw-dropping accuracy and claimed American presence in lands long held by native peoples, the British and Spain. The expedition was hailed as a triumph. The press celebrated their survival and discoveries. President Jefferson, nervously waiting for news, was over the moon. but despite hero status. Lewis and Clark's fates diverged sharply after coming home. Meriwether Lewis got appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory, but wrestled with depression, booze, and debt. Just 3 years after the expedition, in 1809, he died mysteriously, maybe suicide, maybe murder, at a lonely inn along Natchez Trace. His death cast a shadow over the mission he'd led with precision and grit. Meanwhile, William Clark thrived. He became Missouri Territory governor, director of Native Affairs, and a powerful voice in westward expansion for decades. He even named his first son Meriwether Lewis Clark, honoring his late buddy and partner. What about Sacagawea and York Sacagawea, headed west with her husband and kid? Her exact fate is still debated, but her symbolic role in American memory just keeps growing. York, the Clark's servant, became a legend among the native tribes, but despite his huge contributions, Clark refused to free him for years, a heartbreaking irony history just can't forget. The expedition's legacy is equal parts heroic and messy. It opened the West for exploration, trade, and settlement, but also laid the groundwork for displacing native peoples whose lands were mapped without so much as a by your leave. Lewis and Clark's story isn't just about survival or discovery, it's about ambition, resilience, cultural clashes, and the steep price of manifest destiny. It reminds us that exploration is human nature, but realizing what changed along the way, that's the real journey.